Hey guys, welcome to Module 6. This week we're going to look at the powers and constraints of local government, and specifically we're going to be looking at the concept of Dillon's rule and home rule as the focus of our discussions this week. But first, just a quick overview on some basic civics information, and here we're talking about local government versus states and federal governments. The key difference is between local governments and state and federal governments. The key difference is one that's significant, and that is local governments are not sovereign. Federal government is sovereign, states are sovereign. So what that means is the power of local governments comes from state governments and not from the citizens. So the state gives local government their power, and that's enacted through state law. Local governments, however, are not powerless. They are subordinate to state governments that grant their power. They're subordinate, but again, like I said, they're not powerless. Local governments are charged with the primary responsibility for delivering a broad range of public services, such as schools, police, roads, and utilities. And they have broad authority to levy taxes and pass regulations and ordinance. So, although they have less power than state governments, and a lot of times their power does in fact come from state legislatures, they are not powerless. Local governments serve an important role in our society today, and as I just discussed, they have broad authority in terms of passing regulations and ordinances, as well as, for example, levying taxes. And they do provide a large array of different services. Now, why is this the case? Why is it that local government is not sovereign and that they have to rely on state government to provide the power that they need or the authority? And the short answer is the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Local governments are not mentioned in the Constitution at all. Federal government and state governments are mentioned, but local governments are not. This means that the power to determine the scope of authority to local governments is among the powers reserved to states respectively or to the people. Dillon's rule is the decision made by Judge Dillon, which really set forth the whole idea of the relationship between state and local governments in law. And it is, in essence, a legal doctrine that defines the division of power between states and local government. In a nutshell, it states that local governments are limited to the powers expressly granted to them by their state, and to those powers indispensable to the state objectives and purposes of each government. So, he, in essence, made the rule in a case back in Iowa somewhere. And basically, he set the standard in terms of the division of power and how that power is to operate. Okay, that is the essence of Dillon's rule. Dillon's rule holds that state power trumps local government power. Now, Dillon felt that it would be a bad idea for state governments to take full advantage of this legal authority. States need to respect local government autonomy because of cultural tradition. What local governments can or cannot tax and by how much is often structured by state law. So, for example, when we're looking at this in a much broader context, in the state of Virginia, for example, anti-tax lawmakers continually prevent localities from restructuring their tax systems to raise revenue. States have the authority to limit even traditionally exercised local government powers, such as eminent domain or the right to take private property for public use without the owner's consent. So, local government is somewhat limited in their authority and power to do certain things based on state law. Also, for example, when we're looking at cultural traditions, states like Idaho and West Virginia reserve most local powers to the state. In other words, the state plays an incredible role in the authority and powers of local government. Whereas in states such as Oregon and Maine, it gives localities considerable freedom in their operations and their ability to raise taxes and so forth. So a lot of this goes back to this idea of cultural traditions. And so that's what he meant when he said it's a bad idea for state governments to take full advantage of this legal authority. In addition, state governments can place regulatory limits on local government areas ranging from taxes to titles and from personnel to pensions. So, for example, in the city of Buffalo, New York, Buffalo, the city, is prevented from controlling the salaries and pensions of its uniformed workers because of New York labor laws. So, in this particular case, the city of Buffalo is really limited in their ability to control personnel costs of its uniformed workers, which I'm going to go out and guess that it's probably referring to police and firefighters or public safety. So let's talk a little bit about home rule. All right, now home rule states, if they choose, can grant considerable autonomy to local governments. Many states make sure grants of autonomy formal by giving local governments home rule. Now, sometimes you have what we call home rule cities, and some states might refer to them as charter cities, or the freedom to make local decisions without interference from government. In other words, the ability for them to establish a city charter, which is basically the city's constitution, so they can have a lot more latitude and not necessarily have to follow state law on local issues that the government wants to pursue. So maybe it's a land use issue, or using public funds to help school districts, or something along those lines. But they have charters. Okay, that's why we often refer to them as charter cities. So home rule and charter cities are one and the same. Home rule typically is enshrined in a charter, which spells out the powers and purposes of local government, sometimes called charter cities. Okay, so again, states, if they choose, and not all states do this, can grant considerable autonomy to local governments. And then this is again by giving them this idea of home rule, or creating their own charter and becoming a charter city. A charter is the municipal equivalent of a constitution. A charter can only be adopted after voters approve a council-approved or citizen-written petition. And basically, this petition is the charter. It's what the city wants to do, or things that they anticipate they will be able to do if they can act independent of state authority. Even under home rule, however, states may place some strict limits on local government autonomy. So they're not going to, as a state or as a city, you're not going to be totally autonomous, but you will have a significant latitude as you pursue different means that are important to your community. So, for example, I was looking at a charter proposed for the city of Carson, California. And some of the things that they were going to establish for the charter is, for example, the ability to exercise full authority over the municipal affairs, use incentives beyond that available to general law cities, which are cities that states don't allow home rule. So you're in general, you're basically a general law city. So use incentives beyond that available to general law cities to track business and responsible development and economic growth. Establishes greater land use powers on the city to eliminate nuisances and implement planning goals and policies of the cities. Providing local preference of 5% on contracts up to $1 million. In other words, in this particular city of Carson, if they have a significant public works project, they want to give it to a local vendor, somebody that has a business in Carson. Okay, so those are just some of the ideas. So those are the things that are part of when we talk about charter cities, or we talk about home rule. These constitutions or charters is where they lay out what it is that they want to do. And so typically the city will provide a list of things that they want to do, some of the pros, I guess, and then they'll offset it with some cons on basically describing some of the limitations or limits that the city also plans on imposing as they pursue this idea of becoming a charter city. So again, these are things that oftentimes have to be adopted by city council. after voters approve a council approved or citizen written petition. So again, we talk about citizen involvement. Here might be a good example of how we get citizens involved in the whole idea of creating a charter city, because you want to get your citizens involved in this process because it's going to go to a vote. And so the more prominent citizens have, or the more prominent positive reviews you get for becoming a charter city, you might be able to get better local control, then citizens will come out and approve it. If citizens don't approve it, then you return back to your general law city and you're not a charter city. So that's a very important step here. But again, it does tie in nicely into some of the things we've talked about. Specifically, we talked about the whole idea of citizen involvement. So you might, in this case, think about a charter city committee citizens panel to evaluate the pros and cons of becoming a charter city. So when we look at some of the pros and cons associated with, let me get rid of that, there we go, associated with charter cities or home rule. Even some who advocate home rule support keeping a measure of state control. So you're not totally giving up control. The state will have certain authority over the municipality. For instance, city employees may prefer state protections to giving the local mayor or city manager too much authority. So in this case, as you draft your charter city amendment, you might make it specific that, you know, the city will continue to follow state law regarding these provisions, and one of them may in fact be rights of city employees. Anti-tax groups often fear that independent cities free of state regulations will raise new taxes. So again, even if you want to become a charter city or use the home rule option, that could be in your charter. If your constituents are afraid about raising that you're going to raise taxes, then somehow you can put something in your charter so that the citizens will understand that that's not something that's going to happen. But again, that's something that local government and those who draft a charter would have to put in the charter or the city's constitution. Some basic pros and cons, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because that's part of your assignment this week, but it does free up cities from state and county regulations. So maybe in terms of land use, for example, your ability to better control how you want to do your land use management and not necessarily rely on state law. Ability to chart one's path. You have the ability to try and bring in, for example, businesses into your community. You have other ways, for example, that you might be able to save money. For example, with Carson, one of the things was they wanted to establish procedures for the procurement of supplies, services, construction contracts, and the like in a manner that varies from that provided by state law. And state law has some restrictions. So in this case, Carson thought this would be a good thing to put in our charter because it would give us some leeway and some latitude in terms of how we go about purchasing supplies and services and implementing service contracts, those type of things. Some cons, some people might argue that it gives too much power and lack of state oversight. Too much power in the sense to your city manager and your city council, and state oversight becomes less. Personnel rules and taxes, for example, are maybe some of the cons that people might not, that people might be concerned about. So you can take a look at these this week and evaluate the pros and cons. You know, there are probably some significant pros that will allow cities to further develop their land management projects, so you don't have to go through the state. There's also some other ways that the cities will be able to hopefully minimize cost or give them some other latitude. But the other thing of concern is, as I pointed out earlier in our announcement for the week, the city of Bell, California, which was in fact a charter city, and how the city council, the city manager, and a handful of city leaders were able to build the city out of ridiculous salaries. And a lot of that they were able to do because they were a charter city. Okay, that's it. I got it under 15 minutes this week. The resources this week are great, so make sure you read those, read the announcements and everything else. Have a great week.